All right, in this video, I am going to introduce the idea of radians. Radians are another way to measure angle measures instead of degrees. So the first thing I want to talk about when I talk about radians is thinking of a unit circle. Remember, a unit circle is a circle where our radius is equal to 1. And so in this unit circle where the radius is 1, we can talk about the circumference. The circumference is equal to 2 pi r, and in this case, r is 1. So here we have a circumference of 2 pi units. And that's important because radians, notice, sounds like the word radius, and that is not a mistake. Since we are measuring the angle in terms of the circumference, basically, we can think about the fact that one full rotation around the circle, that's 2 pi units in radians. So this can be thought of as 0 radians and also 2 pi radians. 0, we haven't gone around at all. 2 pi all the way around. Now we can think about that since it's all the way around is 2 pi, halfway around is pi units. So from here over, that angle is pi radians. And if we think of half of the half circle, which would be this quarter circle, well, half of pi is pi over 2. Since half of the circle is pi and a quarter of the circle is pi over 2, then 3/4 of the circle, or 270 degrees, would be pi plus pi over 2, which is the same as 2 pi over 2 plus pi over 2, which is 3 pi over 2. So down here at 270 degrees, that's going to be 3 pi over 2 radians. And we can continue thinking about the unit circle in this way. Half of a quarter, so coming up here to 45 degrees, half of pi over 2 is pi over 4. So 45 degrees is pi over 4 radians. Then we can think of 90 degrees as 2 pi over 4, which is the same as pi over 2, and 135 degrees as 3 pi over 4, and 180 degrees as 4 pi over 4, which is the same as pi, and 225 degrees as 5 pi over 4, and 270 degrees as 6 pi over 4, which is the same as 3 pi over 2, and 315 degrees as 7 pi over 4. Lastly, 2 pi, or a full circle around, is 8 pi over 4. So notice that what we're doing is we are going around the circle in 45-degree increments. So we're starting at 0 and we're going 45 degrees, that's pi over 4 radians. Adding another 45 degrees is 90 degrees, and it's 2 pi over 4 radians, or pi over 2 radians. Adding another 45 degrees is 135 degrees, so we're now at 3 pi over 4. Adding another 45 degrees is 180 degrees. We're at 4 pi over 4, or pi radians. Adding another 45 degrees, we're at 225 degrees, so we're at 5 pi over 4. Coming down here to 270 degrees, we're at 6 pi over 4, which is the same as 3 pi over 2. Adding another 45 degrees, we're at 315 degrees, 7 pi over 4. And our last 45 degrees to complete the unit circle, we're at 8 pi over 4, which is also 2 pi. So we're going to do the same kind of thing now, but we are going to break this 180 degrees into 6 pieces, so 30-degree pieces. So at 30 degrees, that's got to be pi over 6, because if 180 degrees is pi radians, divide that by 6, 180 divided by 6 is 30 degrees, and pi divided by 6 is pi over 6. All right, so now we add another pi over 6 to our first pi over 6, and we're at 60 degrees. At 60 degrees, it's going to be 2 pi over 6, which is also pi over 3. Pi over 3. And notice that's pi over 3 radians. And notice that that pi over 3 at 60 degrees is the same as pi over 3, or 180 degrees divided by 3. Continuing on, adding another 30 degrees. We're at 90 degrees here. So we're at 2 pi over 6 plus another pi over 6 would be 3 pi over 6. 3 pi over 6 is also pi over 2. Adding 30 degrees, we are at 4 pi over 6 at 120 degrees. 4 pi over 6 is 2 pi over 3. 4 pi over 6 plus 30 degrees is 5 pi over 6. Adding another 30 degrees and pi over 6 radians is 6 pi over 6, which is pi. Adding another 30 degrees to 210 degrees, and in radians, adding another pi over 6 units to the 6 pi over 6 is 7 pi over 6. Adding another 30 degrees and pi over 6 units is 8 pi over 6, which is 4 pi over 3. Adding another 30 degrees is 270 degrees, and 8 pi over 6 plus pi over 6 will be 9 pi over 6, and 9 pi over 6 is equal to 3 pi over 2. Adding another 30 degrees to 300 degrees, and pi over 6 units will be 10 pi over 6. 10 pi over 6 can also be written as 5 pi over 3 radians. Adding 30 degrees to 330 degrees is 11 pi over 6 radians. So we added pi over 6 units to 10 pi over 6 radians. And adding another pi over 6 units as we add radians as we add 330 degrees is 12 pi over 6, which is the same as 2 pi. I hope that this explanation of radians makes sense to you, and it'll help you understand what it is when we're talking about radians. The basic idea is that we're talking about parts of the circumference of the unit circle, and the unit circle has radius 1. Have a good day.